Yeah.
We got to feed people. We've got to create solutions. There's going to be an element of perennials, I'm sure, in there. And gosh, I applaud the work you're doing.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's exciting. There's a lot of momentum right now with Kernza, both in the U.S. and Europe. I was just meeting with a group in Kenya that was interested in trialing Kernza to see if it would grow on the slopes of Mount Kenya. We don't know because of the day length in particular, how well suited it is. We think it might need more of a temperate latitude, dark and light set of seasons to trigger the vegetation growth and seed production. But there's one way to find out, and a lot of people are excited.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Hello and welcome to Care More, Be Better, a Circle B podcast. Each week, I invite you to care more so that together we can create a better world. As part of our commitment to create that better, greener world, I'm planting a tree for each new subscriber on my website, circleb.co. When you join our newsletter, you'll be the first to hear about new episodes, exclusive promotions, and more. Join our circle by visiting circleb.co today. We have quite the treat in store for anyone interested in the future of food, as today we get to connect with Dr. Tim Cruz. He is the Chief Scientist, International Program Director, and Director of Ecological Intensification at the Lands Institute. His work there promises to transform agriculture from being an ecological liability to an asset. He first visited the Lands Institute in 1981 after reading New Roots for Agriculture as an undergraduate majoring in agroecology at my alma mater, University of California, Santa Cruz. Over the next 3 decades, he pursued a doctorate degree at Cornell, carried out a postdoc fellowship at Stanford, and developed an agroecology program at Prescott College in northern Arizona. Our paths do echo one another in some really interesting ways, which I'm sure we'll get into today, since both my undergraduate studies and my graduate studies at Prescott are underway now. Now, I've spent nearly 3 decades in the field of health and nutrition, so I am really excited to connect with him today. I couldn't be more excited for all of you. Now, Dr. Tim Cruz, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Corinna. It's great to be here on this beautiful autumn afternoon.
Now, you have been a champion of all things related to food growth and ecological synergies for the entirety of your career. You, as I mentioned in your intro, even first visited the Land Institute back in 81. What set you on this path, even at a time when it wasn't quite so popular a field in agriculture?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. A lot of things happen, but there are a few milestones. I think one was reading The Unsettling of America by Wendell Berry when I was in high school. And that book kind of changed the scope of consideration from being a high school kid that was actually interested in organic gardening in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to thinking about agriculture in the big picture and how it is this ecosystem that is transformed nature into our food producing ecosystem, and how it's impacted the relationship of how humans even relate to the earth that we're a part of, or maybe we don't think we're a part of. And so that really made me look around for a university that had something to do with what I now call agroecology. And UC Santa Cruz had a farm and garden program that caught my eye. Almost no school farms existed back then. And I decided, oh, that one looks pretty good. And being from New Mexico, Santa Cruz was a crazy place to go to with an ocean and redwoods, and very, very different than the arid Southwest. And so, yeah, I ended up at Santa Cruz. come to find out, I did the farm and garden apprenticeship, which was a 6 months intensive kind of internship, which I learned a lot of wonderful horticulture that has informed my gardening career and a lot of plant finesse over the years. But I came to realize that that program was not integrated into the academics of UC Santa Cruz at that time.
Hmm.
Still isn't really. But the agroecology program hatched while I was there, with Steve Gleesman arriving as a new professor. And I immediately started taking his classes. And it was in one of those that I read New Roots for Agriculture. My folks had actually moved to Kansas after I left for college in New Mexico. And I came back for a winter break. My dad and I drove over here to check out this place, the Land Institute, of the guy who wrote New Roots for Agriculture, Wes Jackson. And at that time, this place was only 5 years old. And now it's almost 50, coming up on the 50th anniversary next year. So the Land Institute had definitely been simmering in the background of my agroecology professional development for many, many years. But it finally came to a head when I went to Prescott College and developed the agroecology program there. So
Yeah.
it's a
I'm
little
now looking at that as
background.
I'm now looking at that as a potential course I'm taking, I think, in the summer term. One of the courses that you helped to design, which will be incredibly, and it'll just be a treat. Now, I understand agroecology is defined as the application of ecological principles to agricultural systems and practices, or the branch of science that's concerned with this. With agroecology, we're essentially seeking to increase yields while reducing environmental impacts, which sounds a lot like regenerative agriculture in a way. So I'd love for you to help define how these topics connect to one another. You have regen ag on one side, you have agroecology, and then you have people referring to permaculture. Is this just different language for some of the same things, or how do you see it?
It is, to some extent, different language for the same thing, in that they all overlap, as does sustainable agriculture and organic agriculture, and biological agriculture, even biodynamics, all have some degree of overlap in looking towards approaches to producing food that function more within ecological systems. Kind of what I was referring to earlier is acknowledging that we are actually on a planet and we don't set the rules for living on this planet. There's biogeochemical cycles, the hydrological cycle and nitrogen cycle and carbon cycle, and we're very much a part of these. I'll probably talk in a few minutes about how the advent of fossil fuel energy, or the discovery of it, has allowed us to leave or really relax a lot of how we're constrained by these cycles.
Hmm.
Um, Unlike before the fossil fuel bonanza, when we really were kind of under the same limitations as almost every animal on the planet. But fossil fuels have allowed us to leave those. And so these approaches to farming acknowledge this more than what we might call conventional or industrial agriculture, where, again, we've used fossil fuels to kind of address most of what limits plant growth, using pesticides and fertilizers and irrigation and season extending structures and all of these things that kind of make any one place like Santa Cruz, where that's what my benchmark of where plants like to grow the most.
Yeah, it's
They
beyond
have
aquifers at this point. It's
yeah,
not
yeah,
just
they have
like
the
the
most
Romans coming
clean
in and
water to them.
transporting water, which was the advent of that time, right? Now we're augmenting soil continually. A lot of people don't understand that the pesticides and even fertilizers often come from the petrochemical industry as well.
Oh
And
yeah.
and my understanding is that this is part of what got us into this really severely constrained monocropping system where we just have fields and fields of soy, fields and fields of corn, fields and fields of wheat. Or if I drive up the Central Coast here in California through Santa Cruz County and up to Monterey, what do I
Mhm.
see? I see artichoke fields, strawberry fields. Maybe we see Brussels sprouts over here, but it's very much monocropped, even when we're going by the organic farms. So, I mean, it feels like we have all this knowledge now. We know that there's a better way. We know that plants grow better using the fertile soil that they have at their roots, rather than just dumping a bunch of these fertilizers onto the top, a lot of which runs off and ends up in our waterways, creating other problems downstream. So, why is it just taking so long
Hmm.
to get to where we know we need to go at this point?
Well, maybe in part because the high input method has been remarkably successful at raising yields tremendously and making it very more simple to grow large amounts of food. By simple, I mean less human power. You can mechanize a monocrop much easier than you can mechanize an intercrop or a polyculture. Having trees in the middle of the fields, like is being proposed with alley cropping and has been done historically with alley cropping in traditional systems, involves more human power or much smaller machines at minimum. But if we go back to the question that I was meandering away from a little bit of what is kind of common and different with agroecology and these other methods, agroecology, on the one hand, is this science of how we can develop or how to interpret food producing ecosystems ecologically. And so, like when you bring up a monoculture, well, agroecologically, what's the issue with monocultures? Well, there's a huge welcome mat for maybe one pest that gets into a population of wheat and then just goes right through it because it doesn't run into another plant that could disrupt its spread. If you have multiple species, like we see in almost all natural systems, you tend to have pests, insects, and pathogens or diseases regulated. They're suppressed by their inability to just sweep through a population. That's a kind of a ecological interpretation of an agricultural system.
Hmm.
Similarly, weeds. I mean, weeds happen when there's sunlight or water or nutrients that are not fully being taken advantage of by the vegetation. And so if there's some hanging around that aren't being used, there's plants that are very good at finding those resources, and we call them weeds, but they get into our fields, and then they're a huge issue because then they start to compete with our crops. So the agroecological insight might be, let's figure out cropping systems that minimize the availability or the cropping systems that take full advantage of those resources. And oftentimes those are intercrops, like three crops growing together to really fully take advantage of light, nutrient, and waters. So agroecology is utilizing what we can learn from natural systems as well as traditional farming systems of indigenous or ancestral peoples who produced food for eons without fossil fuel inputs. And so they had just solar energy growing their crops to provide the labor energy to produce food in their agriculture. And so many ingenious approaches to producing food were developed through trial and error by many cultures. So that's kind of the scientific side of agroecology. There has developed more of a social justice movement side of agroecology as well. In many countries where peasants are struggling for land and resources, and oftentimes challenged with political forces that are favoring large scale monocultures or removing land access for what in one way or another. Bananas, cash crops, you name it. And so that movement is a kind of a different, the other side of the coin to the science of agroecology. And I would say that the field of agroecology is trying to reconcile the science with the movement and seeing if they can coexist within that same term. They're both highly justifiable, very forward-looking, but have slightly different ends in terms of what they're about. One is a science, one is more of a normative social movement, and yeah. So that's a unique aspect of agroecology. Regenerative agriculture tends to be a really general term that conjures up science, but is not specifically detailing what it means. It means a lot of things to a lot of people, and I think what holds the regenerative agriculture movement together is the idea that agriculture can actually function to improve the ecosystem of agriculture through cover crops, through no-till. But that right there is one of the conflicts. Some people don't think herbicides should be used in regenerative agriculture. Others will say, oh, well, in order to have no-till, we have to apply herbicides and at scale. And so that's a term that is relative. Well, Rodale came up with it in the 80s, and it's relatively new in terms of how it's caught on.
Yeah,
To
I've been a part of
replace,
some of these debates, right? And there's two sides to this conversation that I think are really interesting and important, right? On one side, you have the regenerative organic certification group that wants you to basically take organic and improve it to be regenerative. So you're kind of piggybacking on the organic movement already, but organic is only about 5% of total crop growth. And then on the other side, you have Gabe Brown, and he's got a certification called Regen, and he has a 5-step process to move people more towards organic and away from use of a lot of these pesticides and things like that. But that also acknowledges 95% of the growers are not organic already. So you have to build something that they can lock onto and hold on to, and they maybe want to do things better and stop doing so much application of pesticides, but you're not going to get them to the end game overnight like this. And so, I mean, I tend to believe that that makes a lot of sense. I think there's a place for both schools of thought, but I even have been encouraged by certain applications of technology. Like, for instance, I interviewed on this podcast one of the co-founders of Monarch Tractor, and they are building a fully autonomous tractor that's electric, that you can run programmatically, and where you can attach lasers to the thing and it can zap weeds. It can identify the broadleaf weed by its you know by its leaf pattern
Mhm.
and zap that particular weed. You can program it on a course and it can go out there and do the work without like you having to physically man it. And so I think there's one part where we've got this really interesting technology that is becoming more broadly available, which can minimize our need for some of these pesticides, which are also a huge cost center for farmers. Like millions of dollars a year by large farmers are just spent on things like pesticides and fertilizers. And so the arguments for shifting to a more organic way of doing things are strong, so long as they can make it work on the bottom line with regard to man hours and other investments. And I think it's really scary for a lot of them to change so much right at once, right? So I mean, this is kind of my top line perspective of, okay, it's complicated. We can take steps to go in the right direction. But what you're doing at also the Land Institute is really interesting in the perennial crop space. So I want for people to think about these issues at the same time, perhaps revisit some of these older episodes where I've dug into these issues, and then learn about what you're doing specifically with Kernza. You sent me about a week ago an article that had just launched in Anthropocene magazine called Wheat on Repeat, which I'll link in show notes. And it did a deep dive into this interesting work that you're doing in the Kernza space. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing up Kernza. I mean, it is the perennial grain crop that we have advanced into the commercial realm, or maybe just that farmers are growing it and people are making things out of Kernza now, in contrast to the other perennial grain crops that we're developing, which are not at the point of releasing them yet into the agricultural commodity or even local food production sphere. And yeah, Kernza is a deep rooted grass from Eurasia. and it was introduced into the US as a forage grass earlier in the 20th century. And it's not particularly invasive. It's just a very productive forage that is of high quality and is planted still to this day across Montana and the upper latitudes parts of the U.S.
To help feed
Robert
grazing cattle, right?
Yeah, exactly. Rodale in the 1980s kind of took a challenge by Wes Jackson, the founder of the Land Institute, along with Dana Jackson, um, to try and identify prospective perennial grains or prospective wild perennial plants that could turn into perennial grains. And they did a couple of cycles of selection on it in the late 80s, early 90s, and then shelved it. Late in the 1990s, they offered it to the Land Institute to, as a resource for us to take and see what we could make of it. Early 2000s, Lee DeHaan had just come on as a plant breeder at the Land Institute and was working on developing a perennial wheat through what we call wide hybridization. And this is where you take an already existing annual crop, wheat, and cross it with a perennial cousin, which is Kernza now. It's intermediate wheatgrass, the forage grass, a relative of wheat, not closely related, but related enough that they can, every once in a while, if you cross-pollinate them, you will get a viable plant. And that's what happened in Lee's early program and now Shuin Wang's wheat breeding program, where they've made some hybrids and then you work on back crossing that wheat hybrid to wheat or to Kernza and improve on the performance of that hybrid over time. That work continues to this day. It's genetically challenging because this hybrid is a little unstable. And so it's a slow process to develop a perennial wheat. But there's a lot of attributes that are already there because of the annual wheat parent. But back to what Lee DeHaan was doing, he was doing this crossing work, but he also just had a little patch of intermediate wheatgrass on the side that he was selecting on just cycle after cycle for a few years of traits of agricultural interest, like yield and like not dropping your seed at the end of the year, like wild species tend to do. And he made much faster progress than he thought was possible. He saw changes in this intermediate wheatgrass that were like, oh, this is worth trying, and actually ratcheting up the scale of this selection program and seeing what happens. Well, it responded really well. And there's been quite a few of what you call traits or characteristics of this wild plant becoming a grain that have improved dramatically over the last now, what is 15, 20 years. Lee DeHaan became a full-time breeder of intermediate wheatgrass about 12 or no, more like 15 years ago. He came up with the name Kernza, which describes this grain, and it has kind of taken off. We released it before it was ready, and it's still in some ways not ready to be a grain crop. It's a proto crop. It's a work in progress that is probably almost halfway to where we think it will become in 10 to 15 years as a full-fledged, viable perennial grain that could be a economically viable choice for many growers across the Midwest. Right now, it's still in the kind of early stage at which early adopting farmers who are somewhat adventurous and really interested in agroecology, they want to try it and they want to get in on this, because it does deliver such profound soil health attributes. It all but eliminates erosion. It starts to build soil organic matter. It retains nutrients, prevents nutrients from running off either through leaching or into waterways through runoff and erosion. And boy, in Kansas and a lot of other states, those nutrients going into waterways cause a lot of contamination. They stimulate growth of blue-green algae and make water bodies almost toxic. If your pets drink out of a lake in Kansas in August, they just might die in some
Oh,
cases. It's that toxic.
well, and I've even seen like they have warning signs in our local fields where they that if your dog develops like leakage, like they're constantly licking at their genitals, it may be that they drink some of this water that's contaminated. You need to take them to the vet, as
Yeah,
an early warning sign.
those are probably herbicides or endocrine disruptors or something. But yeah, there's so many
Mm,
things that can run off of a high input farm field. And so by having a crop that does not leak nutrients and that does not need tilling, therefore can build soil organic matter and actually improve soil health over the time that it's growing and producing. It's not a cover crop that you just have to incorporate and isn't producing food. The food producing crop is healing the planet. And that's
wow.
the
So
promise of these perennial grains.
I've gone ahead for those that are on YouTube watching this or watching the video version of this podcast, and I've pulled up the article in Anthropocene magazine, which again I'll link with show notes. But they're essentially this is by Emma Bryce, and she's actually covering here a Kernza based pasta. I believe there's also an image right here. This is Kernza growing in a field, and I mean it looks simply beautiful. It looks a lot like wheat to me. It looks a lot like the forage hay I would give my horse. And then we also, I think, later on in the article, it shows the rootstock. Here we are. So, to give people context, there's a gentleman here holding up a tuft of the grass, right? And the rootstock itself is taller than he is. So,
Yeah.
this has to do with the potential of this particular plant to both be incredibly drought resistant because its roots go so far down into the soil, right? Stabilize soil, help sequester carbon, do all these incredible things. My question for you with regard to this Kernza as an opportunity crop is whether it would also be commonplace on, let's say, the part of a grower. Like, let's say somebody is to go ahead and say, yes, we're going to lean into Kernza, we're going to grow this in broad swaths of fields. Now, they've traditionally sprayed wheat fields with glyphosate to get everything to dry up at the same time so they can harvest all at once. Would that problem exist here too? Or what are your thoughts on that?
The problem being specifically, Corinna, what was the problem you're identifying there?
Just farmers' propensity to wanna harvest the crop all at once, so applying something like glyphosate to be able to dry
Yeah.
the crop so it can be harvested at the same
Well,
time.
hold on one sec with that photo, and I will answer your question. But I wanted people to see above the gentleman's head is a wheat root system. That's wheat on the
Oh,
and that's Kernza literally in the soil on the left. That's partly why Kernza and other perennial grain crops builds more soil organic matter is that amount of carbon actually going into the ground, which is the part of the plant that actually stimulates the greatest accumulation of soil organic matter. But it also explains why nutrients have a really hard time escaping below ground from that root mass on the left. And keep in mind that the roots on the right are wheat at their fullest maturity. For most of the year, you have just minimal roots, smaller seedling roots occupying the soil, or none at all. And so the propensity for soil to erode and for nutrients to leak, and then the tillage to keep that system going because it's an annual plant and you can't have vegetation that you're putting that annual seed into the ground that's going to compete with it. Boy, that opens up a lot of vulnerable land to the elements and to invasion by weeds and things like this. So that photo is really useful to just visualize a lot of why we're interested in developing crops that are on the left of that photo, keeping in
mm,
mind that most natural ecosystems are dominated by perennial plants like the one on the left. That's forests, grasslands, savannas, rainforests, tundra, deserts. The majority of the plants producing biomass are perennials. And this sums it up perfectly. Uh,
yeah, I love it. Now it also
just gotta
reveals
talk
for
about
me
that.
It reveals for me, if you look on the right and we're looking at the wheat rootstock, it really does not have deep roots. I did an archaeology dig back in 1997, 98. It was a collaboration with Université de Paris, Centre archéologique de l'Université à Paris,
Oh.
and also University of Iowa. And so I went to France, did this dig in the middle of a wheat field, which was just on the coast of a Oise river. The Oise has sloping banks, and every year it would just flood a little bit, but gently, right? So the site in the middle of this wheat field was perfectly preserved. And to get down to level, the first thing we had to do was remove the wheat. And we found that using sickles, in the middle of the field was only so good because we eventually had to get the root balls out anyway. So we just started pulling it out.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually fairly easy to pull out in clumps as opposed to going through the added labor of first, having to clear the portion of the field that we would be digging. And so just from that manual labor perspective, you really saw it. There's no way we would have been able to pull out these roots.
Yeah, it's hard to kill a Kernza plant by hand.
So theoretically, if a fire were to come through, it would grow back the following season from the same rootstock, right? That's how it evolved.
It can stimulate Kernza to be more productive.
Yeah, because it then adds the nutrients from the stalk back to the soil.
Yeah, and burns off the kind of above ground biomass that might be blocking sunlight from hitting the growing tips of the newly sprouting grasses. So both of those, yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
Jumping back though to one of the comments you made about how more drought tolerant or perennial grains might be in Kernza in particular because of those deep roots. It's not really the case that they use less water. These perennial grains and perennials in general tend to wake up right when the growing season starts to happen, leaf out, and whenever you leaf out, you're losing water through transpiration. The plant is alive, and by definition, water is moving through that plant. So perennials actually tend to require more water than their annual counterparts, all things equal. So like a perennial sunflower, silphium that we're working on, uses more water than an annual sunflower, because so much of the annual sunflowers spent when its life is this big or this big or this big. And the growing season of that is relatively narrow compared to the long growing season from April until November when the perennial is growing. That said, when it rains in Kansas and increasingly with climate change, you have really torrential storms, really intense, just pounds for 2 hours, and all this rain comes down, oftentimes exceeding the ability of the soil to absorb that water. And so you get it to run off. And that's when erosion happens. That's when nutrient leakage happens. And you lose that water resource for the crop over the next month or so. And so when you have a perennial ground cover, because it's been there for a year or 2 or 3, the soil structure develops aggregates or clumps with cracks in between. And you also have individual plants die and decompose so that where their tap roots were or their fibrous grass roots, you have channels there where water can just go right into the ground. And it's been shown quite conclusively that these perennially covered lands infiltrate water more readily and for more volume of water than plowed land or even no-till land.
And all those rootlets that are extending far deep into the soil, they also reach further down into the soil to access water that's beneath them.
Exactly.
Yes.
So when it comes to needing water in 3 weeks with really deep roots, you can go access a much larger volume of soil stored water than an annual can, especially if that annual is relatively young. And this is like a game changer in some places where you may not have timely rains to germinate the crop. And that can be a disaster if you miss 3 weeks of the growing season because it just didn't rain. And in sub-Saharan Africa, this is a particular problem with planting of sorghum and some other traditional crops. So if you have a plant that is timed or can just come up, it doesn't need water to germinate the seed. As long as water shows up at some point here, again, like you said, you can live off of the stored groundwater for a little while in a way that a little seedling can't. And so it's really more resilient in that respect. But it is, a lot of people will say, well, these perennials, they're drought hardy. And it's not that they can tolerate the lack of water. It's just that they're much more functional with capturing it and then getting it to use again.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so many things have resonated for me just in hearing you go through this water use issue. In California, we had something like 11 or 12 atmospheric rivers tear through the state
Yeah.
just last year. So,
Yeah.
in the 2023 to 2024 season was really hard because you get that water all at once.
Yeah.
And when you get that water all at once, it increases runoff. It damages crops. I mean, I went through the Watsonville area and saw some fields that were just underwater.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have that happen, it can cause the roots to rot. You can lose the entire field of food. And really just to see the devastation also on some local animal farms that had to evacuate animals because suddenly the barn was 2 feet underwater.
Yeah.
Just,
Right.
the low point on the land was really in trouble, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so these catastrophic rain events can come through, damage crops, damage our ability to deal with things like runoff, create landslides. Roots like this are soil stabilizing. They
Mm-hmm.
will keep the land in place. And I think
They
that's
build.
something that we too often forget.
Yeah. I think recognizing that the fertile soils that we farm in almost every case were actually developed under the diverse perennial vegetation that preceded agriculture in that place. That's positively true here in Kansas. We have these deep, what are referred to as mollisols or grassland soils, and they have these wonderful dark topsoil horizons that go, about 2 or 3 feet into the ground. And that took hundreds to thousands of years of those prairie grasses that are very similar to the Kernza roots growing and turning over, dying, and microbes consuming that, and their microbial necromass or dead microbes glom on to the mineral particles, and they build these incredibly fertile soils. Those soils are not being made with annual wheat or annual corn or annual sorghum, nothing like that. And especially when you till and disturb the soil and break up aggregates, microbes eat up that soil organic matter very quickly when we disturb the soil that way year after year. And that's why in most of our landscapes around here and most grain producing agricultural landscapes, we've lost between 20 and 60% of the soil organic matter that was there before, that
Hmm.
was there under the diverse perennial vegetation that came before agriculture. So when we talk about regenerative agriculture, how are we going to regenerate that soil? Because, boy, soil organic matter is like the holy grail of regenerative agriculture, right? I mean, that is the primary focus that brings that movement together, is building healthy soil. And here at the Land Institute, we're going, well, if you want to regenerate, let's look to the ecosystems that generated in the first place, that kind
Mhm.
of set this benchmark of what's possible in this climate and in this soil type with these minerals. And in almost every case, the benchmarks people use, like the Soil Health Institute, are the natural ecosystems that exist in that area, little patches of prairie or forest, or they go to a cemetery where it's never been disturbed and they sample that and they go, wow, look what's possible on this landscape. It's incredible. It's almost always the diverse perennial vegetation of that ecosystem. And so we're like, well, I'll go on just a little bit more. There's a lot of interest in putting perennials now somewhere on the agricultural landscape, whether it's a hedgerow or prairie strips or a rotation of alfalfa. People are recognizing, let's get perennials into this landscape because they're really, really beneficial. And so we're just saying, well, let's just not stop there. Let's just go for the actual crop fields themselves and convert them into an ecosystem that is much more like the one that built these soils in the first place. To
Mm.
us, that is kind of the pinnacle of regenerative agriculture. And we think it's possible. We know it's possible. I mean,
Yeah,
there is
I
a
mean, it's
right.
gonna take work, but I'm reminded of a story that Tom Newmark told when he
Yeah.
came on this show, and you might be familiar with his work. He was co-founder of a not-for-profit called the Carbon Underground,
Mhm.
and he also led New Chapter, which is a vitamin supplement company that has since been sold to Procter and Gamble. Um, so he's been in the natural foods industry for a long time. And he told the story of the biodynamic regenerative like field he was running near Luna Nueva, which is like uh, ecological kind of preserve next to the forest, kind of like built in there. And they run conferences and things like that and bring people down to see how they're doing things differently and more biodynamically, right?
And
This
where is that located? Do you know?
this is in Costa Rica.
Costa Rica. Okay.
So he said, we thought we were doing everything right. Like we were sitting here, we're doing all this work to build our soil health and running things biodynamically and interspersing different crops and kind of nestling it in near the forest and water sources and things like this to actually have a really rich growing ecosystem. And what they found was that their carbon was it just paled in comparison to the forest floor. And so when they compared it to the forest floor, they're like, what are we doing wrong? Like, you've been working so hard at this thing. The one thing that they were doing like wrong that they identified out the gates was, well, we were still plowing. So they ceased the plowing and were able to really start to build the carbon within the soil. Still paled in comparison to the forest floor, but not as stark of a contrast. And
Yeah.
it would make sense. The forest floor, I mean, that's the ultimate
Right.
regenerative system, right?
Yeah.
You trees die and entire forests of microbes and mushrooms and all sorts of things come out to like degrade that unit and bring the nutrients to all of the plant matter and all of the little microbes and insects and things that are in the soil. So of course that's going to be like creme de la creme, almost like you would find in, let's say, a peat bog or something like
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
So
I
I
love
see
that
the difference.
story, Corinna. And I mean, when you were mentioning permaculture earlier, I mean, there's a lot of permaculturalists who are wanting to develop a food system that's like what you're describing, that would have forest components and would have
Mhm.
multiple layers in a canopy and grow your kitchen garden near your house and integrate as much biodiversity and plant diversity as possible in the food forest around their house. And it's very it's an entirely viable approach for communities or individuals, and a very challenged approach in feeding 8.3 billion when many people are not living on those landscapes. But the mentality is really appropriate and can be applied in many situations, whether you're going full scale food forest or just implementing kind of what makes sense in terms of water flows and using resources efficiently on this local landscape, wherever you find yourself. So that, like, again, that we're just throwing in that contrast of movements again and ideas that people are pursuing. It's very much consistent and overlapping with some of these others, but permaculture really focuses on your place and the specifics of your local geography in choosing food and minimizing labor and inputs. When you brought up the electric tractor weed zapper, um, the
Sounds
one
like
thing
it.
that comes to mind there that we think a lot about is the amount of energy it takes to even do various what might be considered regenerative renewable practices. And at this moment in time, if you were to implement that system in Kansas, only about a fifth of the electricity would come from a renewable source. The rest would come from burning oil or natural gas. And until we're all renewable in our electrical grids, and Kansas actually has fairly high percent. A lot of states have less than 20% renewables still. And many of us don't think we will ever get to the point where we are going to be able to match our demands for petroleum or gas or other forms of fossil fuel with renewable electricity. These statistics I'm giving right now are before the whole auto fleet has gone over, and the whole tractor fleet and our baseboard heaters and everything else we're imagining is going to go renewable, solar and wind. We tend to think at the Land Institute, and I can say this with some confidence generally, that we will need to downpower some. That we will need to learn to live with less, and it won't be horrible either. But we can't expect there to be some kind of seamless transition where we almost don't notice that we've gone renewable. If you read Vaclav Smil's book, How the World Really Works, when he talks about nitrogen and cement and steel and plastics, there's precious few replacements for those extremely energy expensive underpinnings of modern society. And the renewable revolution does not address those foundational elements of our society very well. So we are thinking we really, really need to create agricultural systems that tend to grow themselves more than requiring pretty energy expensive high-tech inputs to create a sustainable agriculture, which is what I'm hearing with the tractor weed sapper. I'm not dissing it. I'm just cautioning a level of optimism around what I would consider a pretty high energy, meaning GPS satellites, everything that's involved, Musk satellites flying around, to make that system go and make it.
Must Elon Musk come up in every podcast episode I have now? I'm sorry, I had to stop and laugh there because I even
I
heard
couldn't
that
help
the
it.
satellite network he put up in space is causing more damage to our atmosphere. Just like there's no solution that comes with zero cost. And I
Right.
think that's the thing we have to get to the bottom of, is like, we can create some really interesting technological advances that are going to help us do things differently and better. But we still have to get the rare earth minerals out of the earth to support these batteries and these vehicles. Like, how else are we going to power them, right?
Right.
There's an environmental cost to that. Now we're talking about drilling into permafrost, like let's say melting some permafrost in Greenland to get at the rare earth minerals that are there. I mean, it's like, why would we consider doing these things?
Right.
It's just, there's going to be a cost. I liked the creativity of it. I abut a nature preserve here. It's an open space preserve. They have grazing cattle on it because they need to allow rudiments on the field specifically to graze down the grass short enough that this beetle that hunts by sight can see its prey. So it's a preserve that preserves a beetle, a native Californian grass, and a salamander. Now, there are challenges. Guess what? People live alongside it. They plant stuff. I'm even guilty of planting mint. Okay. And if you know anything about mint, mint is somewhat insidious.
Likes to move.
It both flowers and extends its reach by roots. I have a planter bed that I put mint in. And let's just say every year I have to do my best to clean it out.
Yeah.
It always comes back. And what I have noticed in taking my morning walks with my dogs is that if the cows are on the field and they've just freshly walked over this area, the entire area smells like mint. The mint has displaced some of the
Mm.
perennial grass that is being worked to be preserved. Now, I'm not saying it's my fault, but somebody planted mint, probably that lives a little closer even to the field than I do. And um, as it stands, it's a problem, and even that's been identified by the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County. It's like, what are we going to do about the mint? Well, it's not something where we can get a tractor out there to go after these
Right, right.
broadleaf. So what do you do? Like, this is just a small example of what a farmer might contend with,
Sure.
because you have a pest plant, because in their perspective, this is a pest plant, come in and start to create problems on their field. They have to take care of it one way or another. Um, what do
Yeah.
they do?
Yeah. Yeah. These are the challenges, but I like what you're describing is more like what we imagine the challenges looking like for some perennial grain farmers of the future, where it's almost more of a natural history question, kind of managing, tweaking the system somehow, whether it's finding a herbivore that likes to eat mint specifically, or or a plant or plants. I mean, this is a really unique circumstance just because of the desire for really low vegetation, and otherwise there may be something that could outcompete that mint, that would do it naturally.
Hmm.
But
I
yeah,
know.
it's a tricky goal that's being pursued, and a worthy one. Uh,
Well, it just gets you thinking about the whole picture, right? Like initially, when I moved into this spot, there were horses on the property, but the
mm,
horses, they were too discriminate in the specific plants they would eat. So that meant that the beetle wasn't having as much success, and they were seeing the population start to decline,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so then they transitioned to the cow, which was less discriminate, and now the mint has come in.
Mint takeover.
And it's a really unique situation, and so when you observe it and do a little reading on it, it's like, oh, okay, so I might think I have an idea of the sort of challenges that farmers might run into, but really it varies so much by your micro ecosystem in that particular environment. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
We got to feed people. We've got to create solutions. There's going to be an element of perennials, I'm sure, in there. And gosh, I applaud the work you're doing.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's exciting. There's a lot of momentum right now with Kernza, both in the U.S. and Europe. I was just meeting with a group in Kenya that was interested in trialing Kernza to see if it would grow on the slopes of Mount Kenya. We don't know because of the day length in particular how well suited it is. We think it might need more of a temperate latitude, dark and light set of seasons to trigger the vegetation growth and seed production. But there's one way to find out, and a lot of people are excited. But that's true also with some of these other crops. With oil seeds, we have a legume crop that will be for a pulse like a lentil, but also a perennial plant protein, and wheat and sorghum. They're working on barley in Sweden, a perennial barley, flax, and now a perennial quinoa project is
Mhm.
off the ground in Bolivia. And
Wow.
just again, the more that you can have the crop grow itself, because a perennial, you're not reseeding every year, and if you have a agroecosystem that can suppress weeds, then and if you have a legume in there to fix nitrogen, you start to have an ecosystem that requires relatively low levels of labor and resource inputs to produce food. Cycling phosphorus and rock derived nutrients from the food that we take off the field is a really big question. Not one that we address a lot at the Land Institute, but recognize how the recycling of nutrients in urine in particular back to fields that we took the food from will be important in the long run.
Mm.
And that's how the forest works and the grasslands. They cycle nutrients over and over and over again. And since we're living so much in these large urban areas, how do we get those nutrients back to the fields, especially nutrients like phosphorus that are incredibly finite? And
Mm.
many people realize this right now. We will run out of fertilizer phosphorus. And what do we do
And we
then?
don't need it to run off into the lakes and rivers and
Right.
oceans either,
Right.
right?
We use it. We use it once. We dig these big holes, put it on, and then it runs off. And we dig more out, put it on, it runs off. We need to cycle it, and we need to come up with systems that can do that in within reasonable energetic boundaries. And
Mhm.
so, it's these are the when we reduce the amount of energy we're using in society, we'll come up with a lot of creative solutions because then we will have to.
Yeah.
As long as there's a lot of fossil fuels swimming around, we come up with kind of crazy ideas, even in the regenerative and organic spheres, because we just have a hard time not using high energy when it's so cheaply available. But I
Yeah.
won't, I'll stop there on that topic. I could go on, obviously, but I think whenever we're thinking of what makes sense ecologically in agriculture, we have to constantly keep track of what we're doing energetically, because right now, agriculture is a big source of greenhouse gases, and we need to desperately improve on that. And part of it is the fossil fuels that run agriculture.
Yeah, for certain. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation, and I would love to have you back again. We can always dive more deeply into a particular aspect of the energy requirements of agriculture and how that's shifting. I know that to find out more about you, people can visit the Land Institute. I'm going to provide those links with show notes, as well as the link to the article in Anthropocene magazine. Are there any other resources that you want to point people to, including perhaps a book or two by Wendell Berry?
Yeah,
I'm adding that to my reading list.
I said The Unsettling of America. I love the novel Jayber Crow and the Sabbath poems, and a number of books of essays. Sex Community, no, Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community is a great one of his older ones, but he has so many in all of those categories. Just a very rich source of inspiration. And Wes Jackson's book, New Roots for Agriculture, is still a classic, I think, very uh, relevant, and even though it was written in 1980. And yeah, if you're interested in Kernza, also there is a website called Kernza.org that's all about Kernza and growers and where products can be found. But the Land Institute's website also has a lot of reprints, scientific and reprints of articles for the public that are available on it. So yeah, happy to show up another time, and just a delight, Corinna, to intersect with you in person, virtually, given our overlapping backgrounds and interests. So really
Yeah.
a pleasure to be on this podcast.
Thank you so much for joining me. This has been my pleasure. To find out more about Dr. Tim Cruz and his work with the Land Institute, see the links that we provide with show notes. I will be sure to include a link or two to Wendell Berry's work, as well as a link to the article in Anthropocene magazine and also Kernza.org. So you won't have to worry about remembering to spell each of these things. Just visit the blog page associated with this particular episode on circleb.co. It is linked directly from show notes. And while you visit circleb.co, join our newsletter so we can plant more trees. For every person who joins our circle, we're planting a tree through that collaboration with Forest Planet and 1% for the Planet. CircleB.co is a cause before commerce, education resource, and marketplace that hosts this podcast. We offer eco-friendly products that can even help you grow your own food with self-irrigating tools like the Watex planters, one of which I just installed in my upper deck, and all sorts of household goods and gift items that are more eco-friendly and responsible. 1% of your purchase will benefit charities that are Earth First through our partnership with 1% for the Planet. Thank you, listeners and watchers, now and always, for being a part of this pod and this community. because together we really can do so much more. We can care more, we can be better, we can grow our own food source a little better, and create a cleaner and more fruitful environment. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.